2 years, and I've been delivering therapy, one therapy in the community service as well as in the wheel listening service, which I'm going to go over in a little bit. This is purely going to be an explorative, art-based, trauma-informed exploration of shame, anger, safety and identity with men who are survivors, but also persons convicted of sexual offences. I purposely excluded any type of research or any type of comparison to my community work, which seems a bit taboo considering I'm a research conference, but it was just a bit too much. There was a lot to go over, all in all anyway, and then if I'm trying to bring in the research that's already there, even though it's quite minimal, and trying to compare stuff, it would have been 2 hours long rather than 20 minutes. I'm going to overview the service and therapeutic modality. I'm going to explore key therapeutic themes identified, looking at cross-case patterns. I'm going to specifically focus in on a case study which we're calling Paul. Paul is a pseudonym, and I have an explicit permission to use the artwork in any details of the therapy with Paul and other clients within the service. So Creating Change is a collaborative service across 3 different services. It's actually probation. Probation provides us with our buildings and provides us with some front end to run the service. It also is with Back on Tracks, Focus Forward, and then We Are Survivors, We Are Listening. So the Focus Forward offers a personalised, goal-focused, practical and emotional support for guidance, self-development with the aim of resettlement. And then We Are Listening is a one-to-one therapy service over 20 sessions. The project aims are to contribute to the prevention of sexual reoffending by people convicted of sexual offences, to support individuals to process their own trauma, and to support individuals to develop a pro-social sense of self. So, what is art therapy? Even though art therapy was developed in the late 1800s to support veterans with shell shock, there's a lot of people in this room, apart from our trainee, art therapy trainee over there, who probably have no idea what art therapy is or how art therapy works. So we have an awful lot of barriers to how that works as a process itself. One of the main things that I get asked is, do I need to be artistic? There is no artistic skills or creative inclination needed to be able to work within therapy. It uses creative activities to support empowerment and healing, which could be sculpture, art, metaphor, narrative. There's lots of different approaches. And due to this, it's extremely flexible and adaptable. No 2 therapy sessions are ever the same, and the way people interact and work with the art materials can change and adapt across the therapy sessions as well. We have something which we call the 3rd art object in art therapy. So most interpersonal relationships and talking therapies are between the therapist and the client, but art therapy, we have the image or the art making as the 3rd object. And that is usually an expression of the client's subconscious content and experience, exploring and working within their image, which is really good for accessibility and complex trauma presentations, because a lot of the work that happens in art therapy is subconscious. So they could be not consciously aware or consciously understanding of the reparative work that is going on within the therapy, and they could be integrating that reparative experience subconsciously without it furtherly being analysed or talked about or spoken about. I'm a bit nervous. So one of the main things that people come into the art therapy, one of the main themes that is really early off is creative safety. And the image creates and the image activities are not an addition to the therapy, but the main mechanism of communication. And there's generally an enthusiasm and uninhibited engagement in the image making, especially when it comes to sort of like the sensory, soothing experience and aspects of the art making early on. And there's a lot of experimentation with colour and shapes and materials to initiate that exploration of self-expression, which isn't verbally or consciously acknowledged, especially in the early stages. And as a therapist, I don't encourage that either. Sometimes we work with what we call like the unknown. In these images that we've got here, these are 2 different clients, and these are very, very early on, like session 2 or 3 within the therapy, and there's a clear definition between the 2 sides of the image. There's a main focus image, which is then split into 2, and then there's a strong barrier around them as well. Especially in the top image, you can see that display of what looks like a brain. So as a therapist, there's an awful lot of information that's coming over to me, a lot of information that I'm understanding from the images, which I don't tend to point out or talk about within the therapy space. I know that that's a subconscious occurrence that's happening with them, and a repetitive experience that's happening to them as well. But it's really important for me to notice those shifts in those creative process to establishing those safety. And the barriers there that you can see in these images is a note to that as well. Because of those strong barriers, there's an element of, I don't want to talk about this. This feels like it's too raw to be able to talk about, especially with the layered barrier in the top image and the inclination of it possibly being a brain. It could be connected to identity or understanding of self. These dual images are very prominent within this client base as well. And it's also important at this stage to structure sessions to prioritise that interaction and accessibility with the art materials. I always say, if something is difficult or for mitigating safety or risk, then I just shove the art materials between me and them, because it's a much safer place for them to interact, engage, because it's a world which is controlled and is created by them and by their experience of themselves. So that's also really important in the early stages of therapy. A really strong presentation as well in the early stages is control and self-criticism as a coping strategy and regulation tool as well. There's a lot of permission seeking, so there's a lot of, am I doing this right? Should I be doing this way? Is this wrong? And a lot of that sort of like wanting to validate their experience or their expressing within the art making as well. And there's a lot of internalized judgment and criticism with their outcomes, when the outcomes are different from their expectations. You can see this in this tool that I used at the very first session with all of my clients. It's called the emotion colour wheel. Basically, ask the client to think of emotion and attach a colour to it or a shape and an image to it. Every client within this client group were really meticulous about how they coloured in their coloured wheel. Even some clients leaving a very strong white boundary between where they coloured in and the printed line on the paper, because they were too afraid or too worried about being messy or crossing over. There's a lot of self-correction in their behaviours as well. And you can see the comparison with these 2 clients is that Paul is our pseudonym at the bottom there, and he used a material which transferred onto the hands a lot, so there's an awful lot of messiness and transference and a lot of smudging of the image as well, which can lead to distress and avoidance with messy and unpredictable materials. I did find this quite difficult and did admit to not using that material in future sessions, and we sort of came back to that material when we felt ready to be messy again. But then the clients on the top, you can see that the neatness and the controlledness around the way they've used the art materials is also communicating that emotions want to be contained and want to be safe. So everything communicates in the art therapy space, and you can see there's really clear comparisons even in the same techniques. So there's also clear set boundaries set by client pacing. There's a lot of safe and unsafe art making, and you can see that sort of like in the previous examples. The clients will openly express statements like, I don't want to go too deep, or I want to take exploration bit by bit. So they'll be talking about their pacing throughout the art therapy, but that is not always related to the art making itself. They can verbalise what their needs are, but because the artwork itself is such an unmitigated space to them, sometimes they can't be able to express that within the art making. So trust in that therapeutic relationship is really developed through responsive actions rather than words. And a sort of like, an example of that would be offering alternative methods or materials when someone's maybe struggling. So like previous examples, if they're struggling with, you know, something like pastel will say, do you want to use the felt tips? Would that feel a bit safer? And that helps them to sort of begin to state and recognise when they need to focus on grounding and regulation. And then Paul's examples here. So the work that I was doing with Paul initially is that they were finding working with the artwork really distressing and really difficult. So we do a technique of trying to build up a tolerance to being out of control. This is called free drawing or bilateral drawing, where the client has a drawing material in both hands and they'll draw simultaneously, simulating the left and right side of the brain. The concept and idea of this is supposed to be free drawing. It's supposed to be not be guided, not have shapes, not have forms to it. And I think early on, the top image that you can see, what I really love about this image is the fact that it's put the title free drawing. It's that, you know, just something like that saying, I don't feel quite comfortable in doing something which feels so non-directive, so I'm going to give it a title to make it feel more comfortable to me. And like the technique we usually do with our eyes closed, and at this point, Paul didn't feel ready to be able to do that with his eyes closed, so this is done with his eyes open. And a lot of the images and the forms that he created in that image, and that clear definition between the two halves, he related back to experiences of disassociation. So it was still very structured, still very orientated around strong images and influences. But then at the bottom, we got to a point where they could do the free drawing with their eyes closed, and they felt more free to be able to be expressive and more comfortable within the therapeutic space to be able to explore an unstructured sense of reality and an unstructured experience in the therapy space as well. And you can see in that bottom image, you know, that's less structured, less forms, and there's more integration between the two halves as well. So it's also a physical representation of what the work that we're trying to do in the therapy as it integrated the different aspects of the splitting selves. Emotional accessibility, I think, is one of the most difficult parts of trying to deliver therapy to this client group, apart from discrimination, because it's very selective about where they will or won't sort of access emotional experiences. And there was an awful lot of like creative visualization and metaphor completely outpaced the capacity to verbally explore these shameful, difficult emotions like sadness and anger and upset. You might talk about them or label them in the emotion colour wheel early on, but there was no way that we could explore them or experience them. They were very selective about what was safe and unsafe with their emotional experience as well. My reaction to this was to go back to a more sensory and somatic experience, to allow emotions to be held without them being overwhelmed or escalated to overwhelm as well. And this is really well representation in Paul's artwork here. These air-dried foam clay balls were used at the very early stages as a way to sort of somatically ground themselves in the space, and they would either voluntarily sort of bring them into the space at the beginning of the session, the same three balls, or they would ask for them at the initial of the session, and this became a representation of the client's unspoken emotions or unspoken experiences that they weren't able to express or work with within the therapy. And this is what we call the visual library. So we have gentle anchors or metaphors that bring you back to experiences. So we could talk about the clay balls being something which feels like it's really formed or fixed, or something really unbroken within what we were disclosing. But then we had a transformative experience in therapy where they brought the balls out and started just ripping them into pieces. And it was a session where they disclosed a lot and they changed a lot of their self-identity. So there was also a representation of that within the artwork as well. And we were able to then use that experience of ripping up these formed balls as an anchor for future sessions about how it might feel to be able to feel safe to disclose and explore the self in future sessions. You know, an example would be like, do you remember how good it was to rip them up? You know, this is where we're at right now, type of thing. Risk and discrimination, I think, is one of our biggest barriers within this client group specifically. We've spoken a lot about the general barriers within the service, and I think if you times that by a bajillion, this is sort of, if you're working with PCOSOs, if you're working with anyone anyone perpetrators of sexual harms, there's an awful lot of professional and social discrimination, which creates that further harm as well. And this prevalence of discrimination deepens that isolation in this client group and the unmet trauma, which increases not only their risk to the public, but also compounding the harm to their survivor identity. A significant transition in therapy with Paul was when he disclosed that a professional that he was working with, who should have been trained and should have known better, basically told him that he didn't think his sexual harm was sexual harm, even though it was the same perpetration that he was convicted with, which left him with a deep internalized identity that he wanted in sexual harm, and that it was his choice and his fault that sexual harm happened to him, even though he was groomed from 6 years old. So that was an awful lot. That was like 10 sessions, that was like half the therapy, was getting to that point of him being able to accept and understand and appreciate his own survivor identity, which helped to increase a lot of empathy and self-understanding in the client. There's a big misconception that if we improve the self-worth of the PCOSOs, that we're diminishing their responsibility or risk of harm, but actually you can see in the example that it's the opposite really, that when we're minimising and reducing their own harm, we're also minimising and reducing the harm that they've done to others, but we're built in a system which is making them accept that, but then denying part of their own survivor experience as well. And another, underpinned all of the therapy is this hidden shame. And I think another misconception about the PCOSOs is that the reason that they perpetrate is because PCOSO survivors, the reason that they perpetrate is because they are survivors, but actually perpetrators make up less than 5%. Survivors make up less than 5% of less than 5% of survivors go on to perpetrate. And actually what I found within my understanding and exploration is the socialisation of shame and silence, which is pervasive really amongst this group of really early experiences of shaming, concealment and enforced silence, which is also then perpetrated against with their discrimination. Learning how to hide pain and shame becomes a deeply embedded survival skill, and this unspoken shame is then redirected with withdrawal and avoidance and defensive behaviours. And then obviously the dual identity of survivors and PCOSOs often carry and must process both their trauma-driven shame and their perpetrator-related shame. And you can see this in one of Paul's very last images in therapy. All the figures behind the mirror are their experiences of their perpetration and of their sexual harm. And they're trying to perceive themselves and understand themselves in a true way of what they see within the mirror, but then they describe that as being really distorted by these shame experiences behind the mirror. And I think the fact that we have the mirror and the fact that Paul could see himself in any way, shape or form towards the end of therapy was also a sign of that progression, that is, that identity was split away from those shame experiences and they were experiencing themselves individual of what had happened to them and what they've done. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to do a bit of conclusion. I think the art making consistently enabled this group to engage with shame and trauma differently than verbal approaches only. I'm a big advocate for alternative forms of therapy only because it enables choice. And if you've got something that's really complex and really difficult, the ability to have choice just widens our ability to support different client groups. Shame was definitely emerges as a central but really carefully guarded process. It was something that was always very delicately handled and really difficult to bring into the therapy. And the therapeutic change often occurs with indirect and symbolic engagement rather than the verbal disclosure. The consistency of these patterns across the cases highlights a clear need for further and larger scale research, which I'd love to do. And a more robust understanding and evidence of the mechanisms could create further insight to improve support and reduce discrimination on this client group.